Welcome back to CounterPunch, everybody. My name is Eric Draitser, and today I am very pleased to be joined once again for, I don't know, the fourth, fifth, maybe sixth time on CounterPunch. Yassamine Mather, one of the go to resources for us here at CounterPunch on all things going on in Iran over the last decade or more. But of course, the developments today warrant another conversation. Yassamine Mather is an Iranian scholar and political activist. She is the acting editor of the academic journal Critique, a journal of socialist theory, and the chair of Hands Off the People of Iran, a very important organization, HOPOI.org. Yassamine Mather, welcome back to Counterpunch.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for the great analysis that you have been providing. Let's just begin with the most basic question of all. We're talking here on March 13th. We're recording. The developments are moving quickly. The basic question, Yassamine, why? Why this war? Why now?
Very difficult question because Iran didn't start the war. Whatever its problems, it did not start the war. And I would say it was this particular incident, not the actual drive to war, might have been instigated by Israel, or at least that's what Rubio tells us. So um, negotiations seem to be going somewhere. They weren't falling apart. The Omani foreign minister was telling the world on Friday before the war started that on the nuclear issue, which remains, according to US and Israel, the main issue, Iran had made concessions, and it would have been possible maybe to move enriched uranium to another country. Now, some people say that is precisely why Israel uh, pushed Trump to speed up his war. He wanted a war, but to the timing might have been related to that. I don't know. I have no knowledge of how these things work between US and Israel. The reality is that this whole nuclear argument is a bit of a red herring. Um, if you remember, Netanyahu has been saying this for the last 4 or 5 years at least, maybe longer, that Iran is a week away from achieving nuclear capability. I mean, if you count the weeks that have passed, you wonder why Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, enriched uranium sufficient for weapon grade. IAEA says that after the war has started, even IAEA says they don't. So I think this is more to do with Israel's ambitions on the one hand, ambitions in terms of trying to make sure that the Middle East is so devastated that the greater Israel can appear as the, if you like, uh, the force that can dominate the region politically, economically, but also diverting attention from genocide in Gaza. For Trump, there are lots of other reasons. Um, some people have mentioned the Epstein files, but I think his animosity with Iran goes long before the current um, embarrassment he has on that. I think for the United States, there is still a feeling that they have to take revenge about events in 1979, about the embassy. You can see even when he's talking about Venezuela or somewhere else, Trump mentions the embarrassments of the Carter presidency during attempts at rescuing the hostages as a bad time. This is I'm not in US, so I don't know, but it looks like he refers to it as the start of where America great, wasn't as great as he wants it to be. And I think there's those elements that in the right wing of the Republican Party, there has always been this feeling that there has to be a revenge. And of course, they are more vocal about it, but you can hear support for this idea, I think, with Democrats and others as well. However, maybe I've got it all wrong.
Yeah, and that raises the question, of course, about U.S. politics and whether it's simply a matter of the Israel lobby and AIPAC buying candidates and buying legislators and so forth, or if there's something deeper ideologically embedded in the nature of U.S. imperialism since 1979.
I would say the latter. I think there is an interdependence between US and Israel, but at the end of the day, um, it's US that determines what happens, and the lobby works with centers of power, but I don't think it's Israel that dictates what's going on in terms of foreign policy. Yeah.
Absolutely. That gets into the more conspiratorial fringes of the internet that, of course, nowadays are all over the place. But in any case, we don't have time to go into the more sordid corners of the internet. Let's talk a little bit about the internal situation in Iran. This is something that you follow all the time: wartime, peacetime, etc. Tell us a little bit about the internal situation to the extent that you can. Of course, it's a chaotic situation under the conditions of war, etc. But what can you tell us about the internal situation today on March 13? And if you could, contrast that with, say, the internal situation during the height of the protests recently, or the internal situation during the 12-day bombings, US Israeli bombings last year. How is it similar? How is it different?
Okay, well, as you've probably seen, huge crowds gathered in Tehran, in Isfahan. I've seen these two are huge. There are other towns and cities as well. End of Ramadan is always the day of solidarity with Palestine as far as the Islamic Republic is concerned. And very large crowds came even when they were being bombed in Tehran. Some of it are the die-hard supporters of the regime. You know? But I think this crowd, both in Isfahan and in Tehran, looked bigger, looked much bigger. Um, and in some ways, I would say the nationalism, the patriotism that we are seeing as this bombing goes on and takes a lot of civilian casualties in the 1,800s now, or around that figure, but also the devastation it's causing. I think the government is gaining support. Even those who were against the regime during the protest had expressed their opposition. I've heard from some of them that they are now going to these demonstrations. And it's inevitable. You can't, the Financial Times is quoting a woman, and I've heard similar quotes as well, who's saying, well, we didn't think foreign intervention would be like that. We don't want war. We don't want destruction. If you see parts of Tehran, it's completely destroyed. It's not just one or two buildings here and there where this or that leader of the Revolutionary Guards was living. It's part of a whole street is rubbles in a very large number of places. So you really have to think that ordinary people are seeing their country being attacked. This is very different from the time of the protest, but I think the protests have to be judged in various time mm, uh, time zones, timings. So the first few days of the protest in January, late December and early January, were reasonably peaceful. They were getting bigger and bigger, but they were peaceful. And then on the 8th and the 9th, we saw violence. Now, some of this violence was clearly created by agents provocateurs. These, um, if you like, the opponents of the regime say they are agents provocateurs, were Basijis, were people from Revolutionary Guards. Others say the people who caused the violence, which paved the way for the violence of the state, were Mossad agents, were supporters of Pahlavi, and so. It's quite clear that there were people from within the demonstrations that created havoc by shooting at people in the demonstration, by threatening them to tell them you have to shout pro-Shah slogans, which they didn't want to. They were just protesting against the state. So this violence was confronted by, as you know, the Basij and Revolutionary Guards opening fire on demonstrators, and a very large number have been killed. Not the figures that Mossad or Trump tell us, they are just silly. At one stage, I saw they were deliberately doubling it to reach 70,000, so they can call it a genocide, as most of us call the massacre of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza a genocide. Right, we are right to do so. These people were just liars. Maybe 6,000, maybe a few more, maybe a couple of thousand more were killed in those demonstrations. I think it's a complete change in the mood. And in some ways, it's very hard to find a rational logic for Trump's war, if you like, because at the height of these demonstrations, for all the promises he was giving to Iranian peoples that we will be with you and so on, they didn't intervene because it was inevitable that once bombs start dropping on people's heads, the mood will change. And this is what I would say from the last 12 days, 13 days. The mood has changed, and it's not going to be easy to reverse that mood. Even it's not just that buildings are being destroyed. The economic infrastructure is deliberately being hit by Israel and the United States. Some of the historic buildings are being severely damaged, if not flattened. Now, it's not just the buildings that is important. What is important when you destroy something like Chel Palace, something that had lasted nearly 4 centuries, it's the moral effect of the morale, the fact that you make people upset by doing something like that. And you can't then expect a country where patriotism is quite strong not to change its attitude towards the foreign enemy.
Well, this raises another important question that I want to tackle here, since you are somebody who understands Iran intimately, but also understands the Western left intimately. I want to ask about this question of Iranian activism versus meddling in Iran, because this is, of course, a debate that we have seen over and over again on the left ad nauseum. Do we support the protests because we support the rights of people seeking their liberation, or do we speak about Mossad's infiltration that we know and is documented? Do we speak about the manipulation that the CIA claims to be involved in, and do we regard the movement as some kind of astroturfed intelligence operation? And this debate goes endlessly. It wasn't exclusive to the most recent protests. We saw this going back to the Green protests in 2009 and many other examples of this. But I think it has taken on an added significance in wartime. So I want to ask you to talk through a little bit about, well, this debate And also understanding that, for instance, the Wall Street Journal just published, I think 2 days ago, that they officially confirmed that, in fact, those Starlink internet connections were smuggled into Iran by Israelis, who are now admitting that openly, et cetera. So it gets a little bit murky, and I'd like for you to help us to pull this apart a little bit for people on the left internationally.
It's a difficult situation, but I think we can't to deny that a, a sizable proportion of the Iranian population is or was, at least until the war, against the regime. It's not right, because if you deny that, you're denying a fact. You can see this fact. The fact that these demonstrations were and can at any time be infiltrated by the enemy is also true. So denying, you know, just saying it's all the fault of the Islamic Republic is also, in my opinion, a mistake. I think you have to choose who you support in Iran. So you have sections of the left who are just happy to repeat anything some opposition figure in Iran has said. Remember, some of these people, there might be a film director, one is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, although I know Nobel Peace Prizes are losing value these days, but one is a Nobel, they were all calling for foreign intervention, right? And you should say, we disown these types of people. We are not with this kind of opposition. We are not with the kind of opposition that welcomes Mossad agents to its ranks. But what I've been trying to say in the last couple of weeks is that while all these people, between the end of the end of the more sizable protests in mid-January and the start of the war, were saying, is irrelevant. You should listen to what the working class was saying. And the workers' leaflets were absolutely perfect. Notice they were opposing, they were mentioning their plight as people who've lost income because of privatization, because of casualization, because of destruction of workers' organizations. Many of them haven't been paid for months at a time. But, and that but is important, they were all against foreign intervention. Not a single, I read the Wahed bus workers, sugarcane workers, at least 5 statements from various sections of oil workers. Not a single one of them they all clearly said, we are against any foreign intervention. Now, this is the class you support. These are the people you show solidarity with, not the Nobel Peace Prize winner who's a complete idiot, or the film director who just doesn't even know what his politics are. One day he's one way, one day he's another. So if you have principles, I think you can find the people who are anti-imperialist, against US intervention, against Israel, but also have very correct and just demands against the state that it's not just that the state is religious, it's actually quite pragmatic about its religiosity. It is a state that has created a very unequal society where there are billionaires and there is the majority of the population is very poor, where um, casualization and white contracts, where people sign a contract, then the employer writes what their employment contract is, has created serious dissatisfaction. So we can support these people without falling into the trap of, if you like, being part of the liberal opposition that gets airtime all the way, all the time, on CNN, BBC, where
And of course, it's, you know, almost obvious and self-evident that the types of voices and critiques that you're highlighting are not amplified to the Western left. If you're not reading Farsi, if you're not tuned into those sources, you're never going to hear those. And so instead, you're going to listen to non-Farsi speaking bloggers from God knows where who don't really know much about anything, and they're formulating so-called analysis based upon very little.
Absolutely. And the mass media is very good at finding the worst kind of pro American or pro Western idiot to air opinions that really don't represent the views of people inside the country.
Absolutely. And on the other hand, unfortunately, we have on the left a so-called blogosphere, alternative media, etc., that the bar for being a so-called analyst is non-existent anymore. You don't have to know anything at all. All you have to do is have a
Yes,
Substack that, reaches enough people, and you could say whatever the hell you want.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, lamenting the state of the media on the left is not what we're going to do for the rest of this conversation. I want to shift a little bit, Yassamine, and ask you about the region, and specifically the impact of this conflict on the capitalist class in the Gulf. Now, I'm not going to ask you to give us a military breakdown of the situation in the Hormuz or any of this kind of stuff. People can find that from a million other places. What I want to get from you is an analysis of the capitalist class as it exists in the Gulf, the feudal monarchs, etc., and the various billionaires and others that hang on to their coattails, but also what impact Iran's actions will have, not just on global capitalism and all of that, but what will it do to the region moving forward?
I would say the effects in terms of the economy might last a very long time, but let us um, first of all see why Iran had to do what it did. Because some people say, well, these were allies or potentially allies of Iran. By attacking them, Iran has made them an enemy. I don't think they had much choice, to be honest. Partly because they had said this is what they would do, and if they hadn't done it, everyone would have said, well, it was a bluff. I remember the first few hours after the US attack, one Iranian reporter in a British organization, mass media organization, was saying, oh, well, they bluffed all the times that they would attack the Gulf countries. Nothing has happened. And it did. So I don't think they had much choice, but also they didn't have much choice because they can't reach the US. Um, Israel, they have reached further this time, I think, than in the 12-day war, but still the Iron Dome does destroy a very large number of their drones and missiles. So in a way, I think they had very little choice, to be honest. Not that I defend or not defend, I'm neutral on that. Uh, the effect in these countries has been quite muted in some way. I mean, they have gone to UNs, they are proposing motions and so on, but they know that they have bases there. Um, those bases, remember, locals can't enter the base that the United States has in Bahrain or Qatar. They are really, one should consider them US territory. I remember when the US had bases in Iran, that was US territory. So you can't, in a way, okay, there has also been attacks on hotels and so on, but part of that, I think, is inaccuracy of some of Iran's missiles. Now, the problem Iran faces is that on the one hand, these countries at least appeared to be trying to delay the US war against Iran. But at the end of the day, that didn't make a difference. So there's a lot of debate. Was MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, pushing Trump to go to war, or was he actually saying, no, don't go to war? I don't know. And it doesn't matter really. What matters is that for Iran, The audience it is trying to address since October 2023 is what used to be called the Arab street, the man in the street in Arab countries. And they have made successful attempts there. Um, Before 2023 and maybe before the 2020s, Iran was the enemy of most people. They were seeing Iran as the Shia country attacking Sunnis. Quite a lot of ordinary people had some sympathy one way or another with Al Qaeda, if not with ISIS. I think definitely October 2023 changed that, in that they could only see one country showing any form of solidarity with the Palestinians. I don't think Iran actually sent financial help or military help to Gaza. I don't think Iran was involved in plotting 7th of October, as Netanyahu is saying. In fact, Khamenei made it quite clear he was as surprised as anybody else. But for the man in the street in these Arab countries, the Persian Gulf countries, but also beyond Jordan, Egypt, and places like that, Iran became the only country that wasn't, if you like, silent about genocide. Yeah? And that gained Iran a lot of support. Iran has also been very good at social media presence in these countries, musical presence. They have changed quite a lot of hymns that were originally against ISIS and Al Qaeda. So they were, if you like, they portrayed the Shia Sunni conflict into anti American, anti Zionist music. And these are extremely popular in the Persian Gulf countries, in Jordan, in Egypt, all over the Arab world. And I think the calculation was, yes, we will lose the heads of states, but we will not lose support amongst ordinary people. That could have been a miscalculation when it comes to maybe, I don't know, maybe in United Arab Emirates, that was probably wrong. I'm not sure about Qatar. In Bahrain, it's quite clear the local population do support Iran. It's not a big surprise. The Shia community is larger than the Sunni community. Iran has always had quite a strong base in Qatar. So, in Bahrain, sorry. So we are seeing a changing dynamics there. In terms of economy, I think these countries are going to feel the effects of this war for decades to come. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz. It's not just, if you like, the sale of oil here or there. It's the sense of, if you like, the stability that they were portraying. Quite a lot of Europeans, mainly British, but I think there are other nationalities as well, went to these Gulf states because they were tax havens, because you could be a rich influencer and not pay anything, because you could have a much better, for those who had become rich but weren't rich enough to be able to use all their money in advanced capitalist countries, these were good places. And that has shattered. Not only are all these expats returning to their countries of origin, quite a lot of them will never go back, in my opinion, but also in terms of shipping tankers, oil tankers, and so on, it's not just that the insurance is cancelled during the war. I think the premium for the insurance will go so high that it will have economic effects on the economies of all these countries. And also, it's that perception of lack of stability that is going to be as important as anything else. I suppose the only compensations they have is that Iran's economy is being destroyed by US. But I don't know if in the long term that would be sufficient.
Absolutely. I think we should also point out, too, that these countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, they are heavily invested in all sorts of cultural institutions, business ventures in the West. That all of us in the West who consume any form of media are in various ways consuming things that are coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Whether you are a sports fan, watching tennis, watching boxing, watching whatever, whether you're a movie person, the Warner Brothers Paramount deal is underwritten with Saudi billionaire money and so forth. So these countries are not just places that expats go. They are countries that export capital all over the world and buy up all kinds of properties that are extremely influential and valuable. That too is going to drastically change.
Exactly. If you think of the Saudis trying to organize world football in their territory, Qatar trying to become involved as a center for fashion, arts, and so on, all this will be affected. Yeah.
And so many other sort of ripple effects of that. But I want to also ask you about the impact in elsewhere in the world, because we also know that, for instance, with Abu Dhabi and the Emirates, they are one of the major funders of the genocide in Sudan. What happens there? They are one of the major players in what happens in Libya, what goes on, what happens in that country now, and so forth. So there are ripple effects that are not just relegated to the Gulf kingdoms or to Western capital. It is really a global issue, truly.
It truly is. But also remember that the United Arab Emirates, and in particular Dubai, is where the money exchange rate for Iran is uh, determined, right? So UAE had quite a significant role in the start of the protests of December 2025, in that they played a role in the devaluation of the rial in conjunction with the US. And so for Iran, but on the other hand, there are huge numbers of economic deals, financial deals. Transfer of money, even by IRGC to abroad, is done via Dubai. So the United Arab Emirates is all over the place on this issue. On the one hand, if you like, it is the exchange, financial exchange place for Iran. On the other hand, it has all these um, terrible wars where its role is part of the worst enemies of the peoples of those countries. You mentioned them. I would say Libya, Sudan are the most obvious, but there's lots more. The question remains, um, how much did they try really to stop or to lobby against the war? And I think that's doubtful because, on the one hand, they do want a weak Iran. They share that with Netanyahu. On the other hand, a lot of people are conscious, or a lot of people who write about these Arab countries tell me that they have realized since October 2023 that they are on their own. And that explains the deals, the economic deals, long-term economic deals they've engaged in with China. Because in some ways, it's no longer a situation where uh, they only see the US. They've seen the US not paying attention to them. Now, if they were actually lobbying against the war, and this war devastates their economies worse than their worst nightmares, far, far more than their worst nightmares, then we might see a shift in the politics of these countries. And as I said, some of this had already started with the kind of deals that, for example, Saudi Arabia is engaged in with China.
Indeed. And one of the issues that always comes up every time you see this is, to what extent are countries like China and Russia actually partners, or is it just a matter of economic and political expediency in the moment? And I think that much, maybe even more than China, Russia is should be under the microscope there. I want to turn to Russia for a second and ask you about the role of Russia here, because from in my analysis, and this is something I have said for many years, but it's certainly apparent now that Russia is positions itself as an ally and a friend of Iran while simultaneously being one of its most vicious foes. And in that regard, the Russians have deals in place with the Iranians. They signed another strategic cooperation deal last year. So theoretically, the Russians are obligated to, in some fashion, support the Iranians through this war. You now have Bloomberg and other news agencies reporting that the Russians are allegedly providing satellite data, targeting information, and such to the Iranians. Could be true, could be not true. It's not clear, but the larger question here is why the or what role the Russians are playing, because at the very moment that Bloomberg is reporting that they're providing targeting information to the Iranians, we also have Russian sources talking about how Putin is on the phone with Trump, desperately trying to stay on Trump's good side and avoiding making any inflammatory statements at all about Iran. And in fact, in their most recent conversation, it seems that Iran didn't even come up. So the only thing that Putin has said is the condolences on the assassination of Khamenei, and that's about it. So my question for you is this sort of friend and foe simultaneous position that Russia plays currently. And in fact, I've argued here on this show and elsewhere, Russia has been playing that role for many years with Iran, that this is no different than it was with the saga over the S-300 missile systems that the Russians refused to deliver for like 15 years. It's no different from the collaboration that Russia had with NATO in the Afghan war and elsewhere. So, can you talk a little bit about this role of the Russians and friend and foe of Iran?
I think friend and foe is a good description. So there are a number of interviews during which Putin tells the world that Israel is the second largest Russian-speaking country. Factually, this is wrong. Um, I know that is wrong. However, um, he says that in order to prove that he's a friend of Iran and a friend of Israel, right? Um, and we know that there are economic deals, at least with Israel. And you're absolutely right about the, at least, okay, in terms of the actual war, Russia did propose a motion that was vetoed early on in the war, in this recent war. However, on what should be called the assassination of the leader of another country, whether you like him or not, he was not just a leader, but a religious leader of another country. Russia has been reasonably quiet. There are many reasons for this. One of them is this is actually working well for Putin. He's now getting the sanctions on the sale of oil sanctions um, waived, at least temporarily. Right? So financially, that's good. Um, Politically, it's not. If it puts him in a good position with Trump, it's not devastating. He can then bargain about, have a better hand at bargaining regarding Ukraine. So that's another advantage. There has been this radar support. Apparently, that's what we hear, and I've heard it from people who know about Iran's military. But in a way, that is, given their claims that they are an ally of Iran, that's probably been the least they could do, and they've done that. How extensive this is, we don't know. There is a lot of, both sides make a lot of claims that we can't be sure about, we can't rely on. I would say it has done the minimum necessary to keep its relations with Iran going, while the main aim has been no criticism of Trump for starting this war, no criticism of the US or Israel. For example, I don't know if in their internal media they've said anything about the bombing of the school in South Iran, uh, but there hasn't been anything I've seen or read that expresses horror at what surely must be condemned as a barbaric act, but there doesn't seem to be any.
There's also a certain kind of ideological uh, coherence there as well. We remember throughout the 2010s and the Obama years how many of the various right wing revanchist Russian ideologues were invited to Iran for all of these conferences, Alexander Dugin and all of the rest of these crazies that the Iranians would welcome into their fold because they had all these lovely things to say about traditionalism and about this and that and all of this nonsense about the West and so forth, right? And so you end up in this situation now where the Iranians must, in some senses, look around and be like, what the hell was that all about? Where are my Russian pals?
Definitely, yeah.
So I guess we could come to the final portion of our conversation and talk a little bit about the end game here. And I'm not saying end game because I think that there's a master plan that Trump is somehow magically going to follow here. Frankly, it seems entirely incoherent and changing day to day, which is actually par for the course for Trump. But in terms of the strategic situation, how do you see this playing out? Are we looking at a multi-year protracted conflict similar to like Russia's bogged down conflict in Ukraine, where this is just low intensity simmering year after year? Are we looking at something that's going to have to culminate here very soon because the situation in the Strait is so critical that the entire global economy is at risk? Will the United States be forced to put boots on the ground despite the fact that they don't want to do so? How do you see this playing out?
It's very hard to predict what can happen. I think I don't read foreign policy journal, but I always see their headlines because they send it, I think, to everyone in my institution, not because I'm subscribed. And the headline today was "Have Israel and US bitten off more than they can chew?" And rumors are that the US is now keen for some kind of deal. Israel is not opposing that, and it's Iran that isn't accepting. I don't know how true these are, but at least that's what rumors, but on both Iranian press is talking about that, and some of the Western press are saying. And this is not because Iran can win this war. I think this is definitely not the case. However, the longer it goes on, Iran can claim survival. Just survival is good for it. It's taken on two of the most powerful armies of the world, and it hasn't collapsed. It's not totally destroyed. The price ordinary people are paying is very heavy, but I think the state will have a different view of that. And here, one of the issues that some of the media, Western media, is talking about is true. The quality of what Iran has is very poor, but the quantity is very high. And therefore they can afford to lose a lot of drones. They are building drones as we speak. The US and Israel are using very expensive equipment to get rid of these. So the quantity is making this battle last longer than I think the US expected. Having said that, I think the Iranian leaders would be wise to remember that they shouldn't repeat what I would call the Khorramshahr scenario. You wouldn't know it, but during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a time where Iran had slightly the upper hand, slightly, because right now hasn't got the upper hand, but it's at least it appears as if it's surviving, so it can claim it has some stance. Iran had the upper hand. Saddam wanted peace, and they didn't go for a ceasefire. and the war lasted another 2 years. And the last 2 years were worse for Iran than the first 6 years. Right? And at the end, when Khomeini accepted that he had to drink the poison and make a deal with Saddam, that was a bad time for Iran to make a deal, if you see what I mean. So, on the whole, I would say that might not be a good idea for Iran. But on the other hand, they are clearly calculating that the longer they survive, the more they can say, look, we took on two of the most powerful armies of the world. Where would United Arab Emirates be after this war in comparison, in trying to compete with Iran? However, I think the price that Western economies on the whole will have to pay is very high. So my guess is that the US is, as we speak, trying to find a deal. I, for all the claims of Trump of having allies within, I don't know, the reformists, within the army, within who knows where, they don't seem to appear. And given the fact that by now we know that the new nominated supreme leader is definitely not well, I'm not sure what's wrong with him, but he's definitely not well. Either he's in a coma, he's definitely in hospital, whatever is the circumstances, um, there seems to be, the rest of them seem to be united. Now, again, from here, it's very difficult. Maybe there are lots of infighting going on between reformists, revolutionary guards, various oligarchs who own huge sums of money in terms of the finance sector, the banking sector, the privatized sector. Maybe there are battles going on, but you don't see it. Today, if you like, nominated people from both factions were in the demonstration in Tehran. I don't think didn't look like they were being protected. If there was this infighting going on between people who were talking to Trump on the one hand, people who were supporting the regime, you wouldn't have seen Larijani and Pezeshkian, what I would call nominated people from different factions, so easily walking the streets of Tehran in a demonstration where, yes, they are surrounded by people who support the government, but you could easily have all sorts of agents attacking them. So I must admit I'm only speculating from outside. I don't know, but I would say there doesn't seem to be these allies of Mr. Trump, strong men within the government or on the peripheries of the government. And there definitely doesn't seem, I don't see any dissent from within the Revolutionary Guards or the army. And the longer this goes on, the more patriotic people become, the more coherent will be these forces, not just in this war, but my concern would be that after this war, they can become more repressive because they have the upper hand now.
I know we're running out of time, but I just realized I had one other point I wanted to ask you very quickly as well about Iran, and specifically this idea of the allies on the ground that the United States and the Israelis would like to mobilize as, pawns in their regime change attempt. You hear all this talk about the Kurds. You hear all this talk about all of these various groups, Azeris in the north, and the Baluchis in the southeast, and the various Arab groups in the southwest, and so forth. And you I think first of all, most people don't understand the multi-ethnic nature of Iran to begin with. Secondly, I don't think they understand the ways in which these groups are both separate but also integrated into the state. The fact that Khamenei is himself Azeri, the fact that Pezeshkian is of Armenian background, and so forth. So, can you talk a little bit about the ethnic side of this and the let's say foolhardy notion that the United States and the Israelis can simply mobilize minorities and just destroy the country?
First, let's start with the Kurds that That's where they are actually openly talking about. They accumulated 5 groups. I would say 3 of them are the same organization with different names. They are not the entire Kurdish opposition in Iran, and you have to think that of the 15% of the population who are Kurd, I would say 7-8% don't live in Kurdistan. They live in Tehran, they live in Azeri cities, also all over the country. But the groups that have united don't represent the Kurdish opposition within the Kurdish areas. A larger group, Komele associated with Alizadeh, as opposed to the Komele associated with Muhtadi, has issued a leaflet against this intervention, and I would say that's quite significant. So before this alliance, pro-Trump, pro-Israel alliance can do anything, they would have to fight their own Kurdish um, rivals, not rivals, inside Kurdistan, never mind liberating the rest of Iran. Azeris are a different problem. First of all, they did join the protests in January, but they had very different slogans to the rest of the country. And um, it, um, they don't want separation to join Turkey or Azerbaijan. They have linguistic demands, what I would call um, cultural demands. But again, even when I was a child, very, very long time ago, people used to say half of Tehran is Turkish origin. And it's probably got a lot bigger now. So I really, the Azeris are not going to leave Iran, I think, or separate. Arabs constitute about 2% of the population. I was speaking to someone who has just returned, just before the war, returned from the areas where Arabs and Persians live. And he was telling me that the Arabs are actually very pro-Iran nationalists since in recent years. Why? Because the Arabs used to go to Iraq. A lot of these areas have people who are, the family is half in Iran, half in Iraq. Yeah. They used to go to Iraq and come back and say, oh, wow, it's so developed, it's so much ahead of us. Now they go from a town near the border with Iraq to a town of similar size and, if you like, level of development in Iraq. They come back and they say, oh my God, the last 23 years, they have gone down the drain. It's just so underdeveloped. It's so poor. The streets are so dirty. There's not a single proper development built around this place. And that is the effect of liberating Iraq. You can liberate Iraq, and then the Arabs of Iran go there and come back and say, we don't like the Islamic Republic, but at least we have water running in the pipes, as opposed to underdevelopment, destruction, lack of electricity, lack of basic services. So these things matter. So the Arabs are not going to fight. I saw demonstrations in Ahvaz when the war started. They were one of the biggest. And I think they weren't just Arabs, obviously the Fars or the Persians of Ahvaz were on those demonstrations, but I would say no one should rely on Iranian Arabs fighting a war for Trump or Israel or Abu Dhabi or United Arab Emirates.
And just really quickly, can you talk a little bit about the Baluchis and the history of Jundallah, the various terror groups that inhabit the border regions between Iran and Pakistan? We know allegations go back decades about Mossad and CIA controlling Jundallah, some of these other radical groups in that region. Is there any chance of unrest, uprising there, especially given the fact that right now Pakistan and Afghanistan are engaged in, well, it may be not as hot of a war as it was 2 weeks ago, but it's still a hot war. So, what do we see in the Sistan Baluchistan territory?
Yeah. You're right. And remember, this is a very troubled area because, in addition to the political differences and all the political uh, mm, infighting, there is also drug smuggling. And there are armed groups that smuggle drugs into Iran, via Iran, they go to other places and so on. So, and Jandala has been involved in aspects of this. Very often, when authorities or soldiers, or at times gendarmes, get involved with the Baluchi opposition groups, there is elements of criminality as well as independence. So that these have been very brutal fights between soldiers, not Revolutionary Guards. Revolutionary Guards don't need to go as far as Baluchistan, or gendarmes and these local groups. And both sides have had a lot of death in over the years on these issues. However, again, you have big cities like Bandar Abbas, a port where a very large number of the percentage of the population are people from other parts of Iran, including Kurds, Turks, Azeris, who have moved to Bandar Abbas because it's an important port, because there is industry, because there are jobs there. So the idea is that suddenly a few tribes near the border, paid by this or other tribe in the other side of the border, will manage to separate Balochistan from the rest of Iran is, in my opinion, at the moment unthinkable. I'm not saying this will never happen. Israel, US can pay lots of money and send armies and change the scenario. But at the moment, I really don't see that. And uh, a bit like Kurdistan, the Baluchis in Pakistan are rebelling because they get money from Iran. The Baluchis in Iran get rebelling because via Pakistan they get US money, they get all sorts of Mossad intervention and so on. It's not an area that I have visited, so my knowledge of it is not as much as, for example, I know Kurdistan very well and I can predict what can happen. I can't, but from what I read, I think it's a bit of a pie in the sky to think that Balochistan can wage a kind of rebellion that will, if you like, be a major story for the rest of Iran. But I could be wrong, I'm not.
Last couple of minutes, my final question, focusing on the left. I want you to just talk a little bit about how you would articulate what is the role of the left here in understanding Iran. In my opinion, and this is a war I've been fighting for many years now, the left has abdicated most of its responsibility as far as analysis goes in favor of, yeah, clicks and views and subscriptions and all of this crap. So given the gravity of the situation, given what we, especially those of us who consider ourselves Marxists, or people who are interested in dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and so forth, how do we apply our tools to understanding this conflict without falling down the rabbit hole of conspiratorial nonsense, or pie in the sky, horoscope reading, or various other forms of pseudo analysis?
I think the first and most important task is to call for the defeat of um, US, Israel, and its allies. I think that's essential because, in a way, that clarifies where one stands in terms of the current world situation. I also don't think it's a good idea to exaggerate military victories of Iran. I see online a lot of people claiming, oh, Iran has destroyed half of Tel Aviv, uh, this or that person in Israel has been killed, they're not telling yet. Even if some of these, quite a lot of them are not true, but even if some of these are true, let's not exaggerate victories. The fact that Iran has survived is a bit of a miracle as far as I'm concerned. So let's not exaggerate that. When it comes to solidarity, I think solidarity has to be with the people of Iran. This doesn't mean that you go around um, repeating the rubbish that Trump says about 30,000 being killed in January or so on. But it does mean supporting the working class in Iran. And you can be very specific. You can say, we don't support every opposition in Iran. We don't support those who did allow Mossad agents to join the ranks of the protesters. But we do support the Iranian working class. They have been very clear that they oppose foreign intervention. They have genuine demands against inequality, against privatization. We have a duty to have solidarity with that working class. And that would be it. That would probably put you in a less dramatic place, but more down to earth, real solidarity.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. Yassamine Mather has joined us today. She is an Iranian scholar and political activist, the acting editor of the academic journal Critique, a journal of socialist theory. Go to hopoi.org. That's Hands Off the People of Iran. Very important organization to support Yassamine's work wherever you find it. Yassamine, thank you as always for coming to Counterpunch and helping us understand all of these things.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and very good questions as always, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Talk to you again real soon.